Member for Port Moody-Burquitlam.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Well, let's have a conversation about voting. In the last election, we formed a minority government where two parties, the NDP and the Greens, had the opportunity to work together on issues where we have common ground. And together, the NDP and the Greens received 57% of the popular vote. The majority of the people in British Columbia voted for their government. Now, that seems to make sense. That seems to make sense. That's a reasonable thing, I think, in a democracy where the majority of people actually voted for their government. But it's actually rare in our first-past-the-post system. You know, when you look back when the election happened, Premier Christy Clark and Premier Christy Clark and the BC Liberals, they tried desperately to hold on to power, even though they only had 40% of the popular vote. I mean, I don't know if you remember that, but it dragged on for months and months as we tried to get in to become the government that represents the majority of the people in the province. They had 40% of the vote, and they just did everything they could. They even changed their throne speech to reflect everything that we had in our platform, just in this desperate attempt to hold on to power. But this is not an unnatural occurrence, because this is what the BC Liberals have gotten used to. They've gotten used to having all the power without the majority support of the people of this province. In 2013, they received 44% of the popular vote, and they got 100% of the power. In 2009, they received 46% of the popular vote and 100% of the power. In 2005, they received 46% again of the popular vote and 100% of the power. In fact, there was only one election in the last 100 years where one party received more than 50% of the popular vote and became government. Think about this for a second. Nearly every election in British Columbia, the majority of people in this province did not vote for the government. That seems to me that there could be a better way of doing things. The BC Liberals are fighting to keep the current system because they just want to have all the power. The majority of people, they don't care if the majority of people vote for other parties. They just want the power. They don't want to cooperate. They don't want to collaborate with any other party. They just want all the power. Negotiation is not something that they like. Compromise is not a word that they understand. Listening is not something that they like to do either. Unless, of course, it's a big corporate donor or the top 1% of the province, then the ears are wide open and they're listening. But you know what? We fixed that issue, Madam Speaker, by banning corporate and union donations. And now we have the opportunity to fix the issue of the voting system that does not work for the majority of British Columbians. We have that opportunity in a referendum coming up. In a very simple concept where 25% of the people vote for a party, they get 25% of the representation. That is exactly, that's very fair, because that is proportionally representative of what the province and what the people of the province want. And so you only need to look at where this has happened across the world. You look at the data, the statistics on this. Have a look at it. We know that people have a greater sense of satisfaction in democracies where proportional representation is the voting system. So you look at indicators such as the World Governance Indicator, the Transparency International Corruption Index. And proportional representation democracies outperformed first-past-the-post democracies in 16 of the 17 measures of sound government, including areas like quality and independence of public service, quality of policy making, rule of law, control of corruption. And there's another benefit to proportional representation systems. They actually result in a greater diversity among elected representatives. In PR systems, there are 8% more women elected. And you can look at one example of a single country that uses two different systems. Australia, they use a proportional representation system in the Senate and more of a first-past-the-post system for the House. And 2.5 times more women were elected to the Senate than to the House. In Canada, US, UK, France, these are all first-past-the-post countries. None of these countries have more than 30% of their representatives being women. In New Zealand, Germany, Sweden, Denmark, that all use proportional representation, all have more than 30% being women. In Sweden, it's 45% women. Another benefit of the proportional representation system is it actually increases voter turnout. You look at the data, you look at the statistic. In PR democracies, the average voter turnout is 7.5% higher. And the voter turnout among youth is 12% higher. Certainly we want to see more engagement in our democracies. I hear lots of mocking coming from the opposition when we hear about more people voting. Apparently that's not something that they're in favor of, but I think it's a good thing. Another advantage is that proportional representation, and here's a really important thing, there's consistency between elections. When you have a first-past-the-post system, there tends to be a wide swing from one philosophy to another philosophy. One government can undo everything that the previous government did. That's not effective government. That's exactly what Stephen Harper did in dismantling so much environmental protections that were in place under the previous government. Consistency between elections, interestingly, also leads to stronger economies. Countries that have proportional representation, on average, have a 0.05% of GDP surplus. And first-past-the-post countries have a 2.9% deficit. In fact, 9 of the 10 top economic performers in the OECD with the highest GDP per capita use, do you know what it is? Proportional representation, that's right. So interestingly, actually even corporate taxes are lower in countries that have proportional representation, which I'm sure the opposition would be very excited about. And human health indicators are higher. Life expectancy is 12 years more in proportional representation countries. Infant mortality, 75% less. So what exactly is the downside that we're looking at here? We know that the opposition wants to keep this current system because it gives them power when they don't deserve it, when they don't have representation, don't have the mandate of the majority of people in the province. Our government has the mandate, in cooperation with the Greens, of the majority of people in the province. Now, there are criticisms that some may have of proportional representation, that it might result in more elections, more unstable governments, but that's actually not the case when you look, again, at the data, which the BC Liberals are not fond of. Between 1945 and 1998, in proportional representation democracies, there's an average of 16 elections in that time period, compared to 16.7 in first-past-the-post. So it's exactly about statistically equal. There's also concern around fringe parties that may crop up under a system like this. But fringe parties, when we're talking about fringe parties, we're talking about parties that have less than 1% of the vote, and we have a threshold of 5% in place in this legislation that we're amending. You won't get any seats in the legislature until you have 5% of the vote. So let's take a look at a specific case to demonstrate this and how this works. In Denmark, in a recent election, there's a party called the Danish People's Party. It's considered an anti-immigration party. And interestingly, this party is the second most popular party in Denmark. And under a first-past-the-post system, it's quite possible that this party could have formed government and had 100% of the power. 100% of the power. That could have happened. Just like that happened in Quebec just recently with the coalition Avenir Quebec, which received only 37% of the vote and got 100% of the power, also an anti-immigration party. But that's not what happened in Denmark. That didn't happen because they have proportional representation. And in Denmark, a coalition government was formed, and the anti-immigration Danish People's Party, despite getting the second most votes, did not become a formal part of the ruling government. That's what proportional representation does. Now, when we think about sort of the most extreme cases of leadership in the world, I mean, you got, I mean, maybe someone who is, you know, they have fans perhaps in the opposition, but the person that comes to my mind as an extreme leader is actually Donald Trump. And interestingly, Donald Trump was elected with less votes than his opponent, 46.1% of the popular vote versus 48.2% for his opponent Hillary Clinton. Nearly 3 million more people voted for Hillary than Donald Trump. Now, this is a fundamental example of the failure of a first-past-the-post type of system. But there are other examples that have been cited many times closer to home with our esteemed colleague in Ontario, Doug Ford. Again, the opposition a big fan. Doug Ford is leading the government of Ontario with 100% of the power after only receiving 40.5% of the vote. And now Doug Ford is dismantling the work of the previous government. He's canceling the carbon cap and trade system unilaterally, even though the majority of people in the province voted for different parties. He's canceling the Ontario Green Fund, which paid Ontarians to make energy efficiency updates in their homes and businesses. He's canceling Ontario's basic income pilot unilaterally. He's canceling labor reforms that would guarantee that part-time workers would receive the same pay as full-time workers unilaterally. He's canceling minimum wage increases unilaterally. He's repealing updates to the province's sex education curriculum, reverting back to an outdated 1998 curriculum unilaterally. He's announcing hiring freezes across the public service unilaterally, and he's using this notwithstanding clause to circumvent the Charter of Rights and Freedoms in order to reduce the Toronto City Councillors from 47 down to 25 unilaterally. He's doing all this despite the fact that the people of the province of Ontario voted in majority for other parties other than his party, and that can happen here. All the good work that we're doing right now could be undone if we stick with the first-past-the-post system. Maybe the opposition is just waiting for the opportunity to cut back funding on education again, because that's what they did when they were in government. Maybe they're just waiting for the opportunity to shut down schools again and to force school districts to sell valuable land. Maybe They'd like to defund the affordable child care plan that we're putting in place. Maybe they want to put tolls back on the bridge. I think that one's probably going to happen. Maybe they want to put regressive taxes back in place, like MSP premiums. Maybe they want to erase the poverty reduction strategy that we're putting in place right now, because they certainly didn't like that when they were in power. Maybe they want to remove the Human Rights Commission. Maybe they want to scrap our climate change policy. Maybe they want to scrap improvements to the environmental assessment process. Maybe they want to bring back the grizzly bear hunt. Maybe they want to reduce disability rate increases. I don't know what they want to do. I don't know what they want to do. But they could do it with 100% power without the majority support of the voters of this province under a first-past-the-post system. I can tell you one thing I'm pretty sure they would like to do, and that's bring back corporate donations. Because their donations have been drying up. For the first half of 2018, BC Liberals have raised only 59% of what the BC NDP have raised with personal donations. And this isn't a surprise, because the BC Liberals were a party that represented the top 1% of income earners. The party with the most money, with the most representation of people with the most money, and a lot of money that they wanted to throw around. That situation they no longer have because we've taken away their corporate donations. So, we could go back to that with less than 50% of the popular vote. And that is exactly what the opposition would like. Because the idea of a coalition government that requires cooperation, that requires respect, that requires listening to the people of this province is not something that they can support. Well, what do we have to lose? Let's give it a try. The legislation that we have here is an opportunity to change our voting system for the better. If proportional representation passes, we will have another referendum in 2 elections to confirm that it actually is as great as I'm saying that it is here, based on all the data that I've been using and quoting from. We have that opportunity to validate that it is going to be better for the people of this province. We have nothing to fear. We have an opportunity to prove that this is actually going to be a better voting system. And we've shown that we can do this. We can have a minority government with support from 57% of the voters, 2 parties working together collaboratively. Let's trust that we will all be better represented under a system in which the majority of the population is represented in government. Thank you, Madam Speaker.